talking to his toughest crowd, the children upstairs, when I'm firing questions at him, and now it's time for him to have some time with you all. I did want to make one more word of greeting. We have also with us today the companion and spouse and wife of our Bishop Gates, who is Tricia Harvey, and I wanted to introduce her to you all. Tricia, could you stand up over there? Welcome, Tricia. We hope you'll come back and be with us all the times that you can. It's great to have you here. Okay, now Bishop Gates, it's his game from here. He's going to offer a few opening remarks and then take some questions. I know they'll all be kind and helpful and positive questions. It's the only time that are asked around here. And we'll be having some microphones moving around to catch the questions as we go. Over to Bishop Gates.
Well, that was quite extraordinary. Is there a Messiaen setting to the same word? I'll look forward to that. I think, so I'm watching Tricia as you all are singing this. I'm accruing occasions when this strange new calling into which I've been invited invites hilarity for my wife. And I think listening to you all, 300 people sing this to me was probably one of those moments. Right up there with, back in January when I made my first visitation to the Church of the Advent on Beacon Hill. The churches in which I have served for the last 27 years have generally had a liturgical tradition more or less similar to this one. So imagine my panic at the notion of having to do my first visitation at Advent. And so imagine Tricia's amusement when she came into the study on late Saturday night, only to see me endlessly watching YouTube videos of how you sense an east-facing altar. Her reaction was the same as yours. Actually, this is really lovely. For a number of reasons, not least of which is, I'll call this a sort of redemptive moment. Because the last time I stood at this lectern in this space was in March, 14 months ago, during the candidate walkabouts, which, as you know, were, they were a good thing, but fairly grueling, if you will. There were 5 evenings, this one was daytime, and 7 sessions in each one. And of those 35 sessions, 1 was filmed, which added a little extra stress to the moment. And that was the one that was right here in this room. And so that's the last time I was here. So there's this sort of, gut-dropping, visceral sense about walking this, which you have just redeemed. Now I can think about that song instead. That moment, a few of you may have even been here, some of you might have seen the video. It was a moment of one of the greater moments of humiliation for me in the course of the process, when the final question was posed. And so we had a number of questions during that 35, 40-minute session about the diocese and mission and faith and prayer and all these questions. So then came the very last question, which was, if you could be any animal you would like to be, what animal would you be? And I thought, really? That's the question? It shouldn't really have thrown me off. It's the kind of question that you get at, a cocktail party question or an icebreaker question or whatever, and it should have been fine, should have been easy. But for some reason, in that context, it really kind of threw me for a minute. So I was casting about, standing right here. And people are just sitting there in silence, as you are now. And I said, oh, I don't know. I think I'd like to be a bird. Because and I said, because I love when you're flying, I like looking down, I like that kind of sense of perspective, and so I think I'd be a bird. And then I said, I don't know. I think I'd like to be a cardinal. desperately tried to dig out of it and said, no, you've misunderstood. I grew up in Indiana, in Illinois, and the cardinal is a state bird out there, and anyway, it's red, it's the color of the Holy Spirit, wouldn't that be great? And they're all out there thinking, this damn fool hasn't even been elected bishop, and he wants to be a cardinal. So anyway, not my best moment. And now, thanks to Richard and you, I have a different memory for this spot. So, as this being my very first visitation, and so there's really, I don't have a formal sort of lecture or presentation for you. My notion of this time is for us to get acquainted a little bit. So I'm going to start by not assuming that everybody has read everything about your new bishop and just say a few biographical words about myself and Tricia. And then I think just throw it open to questions and answers so that I can get to know what's on your minds. You've already heard at least some of what's on my mind today upstairs. So as the song suggested, and as many of you have heard, we came here from Ohio, where we've been for 10 years. But both Tricia and I are natives of Massachusetts. So I was born out in Springfield, Mass. My dad was a lexicographer, a dictionary editor, working for Gene C. Merriam, that makes Merriam-Webster dictionaries. So we lived in Wilbraham and born in Springfield. And lived there, and then Hartford for 5 years, and then Toronto for 2 years, and then we landed in Terre Haute, Indiana, in southwestern part of the state. People say, well, you moved around. Was your dad, were you an army brat? I say, no, I was a dictionary brat. He took a teaching position in Terre Haute and ended up, my dad was there for 21 years. I was there for all of junior high and high school. Meanwhile, Tricia is a native of Watertown, Mass, so she's a local girl, and grew up, born in Somerville, and grew up in Watertown. And we met in Middlebury, Vermont, at Middlebury College. We met, I don't recommend this, kids. We met on the second day of freshman orientation. Started dating in February of freshman year, and were engaged by Christmas of junior year, married 2 days after commencement. So it's quite extraordinary. Our boys are now older than that, and I can't begin to imagine that we did that, but we did. And here we are 35 years later. Next month will be our 35th wedding anniversary. So we met at Middlebury. We were both Russian majors at Middlebury College. Studied Russian language, literature, history, culture. Spent a semester in Moscow in winter and spring of 1979, so I think some late Brezhnev era. And then graduated in 1980. If one graduated with a degree in Russian in 1980, there wasn't a lot of trade, tourism, it wasn't, so basically if that was one's marketable skill, one either stayed in academia and got a doctorate and taught, or went to work for the federal government. Those were essentially your two options in 1980. So we did the latter. We moved to Washington, D.C. We went to work for the Department of Defense at a place no one had heard of back then. In fact, the initials were said to stand for no such agency. So we worked at Fort Meade at the NSA, which, as I say, really was pretty well under the radar then, though not so much now, for, of course, some fairly notorious things that they've been up to. But as Russian linguists, we were doing sort of things you could imagine. Monitoring sort of Soviet goings-on for the federal government. Tricia actually taught Russian for the agency. In those days, Cold War days, there weren't enough Russian linguists to be had, and so the government trained their own. So she taught for a while, and I worked in operational ends of things, and for a time was detailed down to the State Department to brief State Department people with materials from my agency for which they were cleared. So it was actually a very exciting kind of place to be for a young man kind of walking those corridors. It was a peon level kind of briefing position, but it was exciting work actually, and particularly just kind of well, I just enjoy the language as a tool. I tell people, if you imagine you're someone who loves to crossword puzzles and someone will pay you to do them. That's kind of how I approach my work. But in the meantime, Tricia and I had become members of an Episcopal parish in Laurel, Maryland, outside of Washington. I was raised Presbyterian and Congregationalist. Both my grandfathers were clergymen. My dad's father was a Presbyterian minister in the Midwest, and he didn't have churches so much. He taught at Presbyterian colleges around the Midwest, Maryville, Tennessee, and Parsons in Iowa, and Westminster College in Missouri. And then my mom's father was a congregational pastor right here in Bedford, Mass. All during Depression, World War II, became a VA chaplain at the Bedford VA, and died at the age of 59, quite young. If you're familiar with the Bedford, Lexington area, the Masonic Lodge in Bedford is the Frank W. Thompson Lodge, and that was my grandfather, Frank W. Thompson. He was an active in the Masons. But anyway, so I came from that background. Tricia was raised Roman Catholic at St. Patrick's in Watertown. And so after we were married, we felt it was really important for us to be together. But also, more importantly, I think we had both kind of grown to a place. As many of you, how many people in this room were raised Episcopalian? That's pretty good. Actually, that might be even a little higher than average. It's like about a third, maybe. I think, for me, I tell people that the short version of my spiritual journey is if you take a Presbyterian boy and expose him to Russian Orthodoxy, you get an Anglican. It's like a mathematical. In terms of an appreciation of mystery and sacrament, that was a different kind of spiritual home than that in which I was raised. And then Tricia was raised Roman Catholic, as I said, and was also ready, I think, to find a new home, maybe for less liturgical and more theological and social teachings kind of reasons. Fair? So we joined the Episcopal Church in Laurel, Maryland, and that became my sponsoring parish when, in due course, I heard a call to ordain ministry. So, sponsored by Diocese of Washington, D.C., came back to Boston, where Tricia's family was. My grandmother was still in Bedford. So it was a sense of home for us to come back to Boston for seminary at Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge. Graduated from there in 1987, and so then I was ordained at the National Cathedral in Washington. As I said, that was my sponsoring diocese, but immediately then stayed here in Boston to serve. So I was curate at St. John the Evangelist in Hingham, Massachusetts, on the South Shore. I was there for 3 years, from 87 to 90. So serving in this diocese, though still canonically in Washington. And then in 1990, received a call to my first parish as rector in Western Massachusetts, in the town of Ware. No, who's on first jokes, please? So as rector of Ware from 1990 to 96. Ware is the only town in the Commonwealth that has the distinction of having its radio station and its name be the same. WARE, South of the Pioneer Valley. So I was in Ware, rector of a small congregation in a mill town from 1990 to 96. Tricia, during those years, worked at bookstores in Amherst and South Hadley and around, and our 2 boys were growing up. So we have 2 sons. Philip was born in course at EDS in 1986, and then Ethan was born just as we made the transition from Hingham to Ware in 1990. So the boys were growing up. We then, in 1996, went to Chicago, accepted an invitation to come and be a senior associate on staff with a priest that I'd worked with earlier and admired greatly. His name was George Council. He was rector of a large congregation on the North Shore of Chicago, invited me to come out. The schools were really outstanding there, public schools, which was a concern for us about the boys at that point. So off we went and had 8 wonderful years in Lake Forest, Illinois, Church of the Holy Spirit. So I was associate for 7 years, and then the priest in charge during the interim period after George was elected to be the Bishop of New Jersey. And then 10 years ago, or now 11, in 2004, was called from Chicago to Ohio, where I became the rector of St. Paul's in Cleveland Heights. which, as I mentioned earlier, has a certain familial connection to this place. So, the boys, as I said, 2 boys. Philip's a graduate of Bowdoin College and is in stage theater, and is in New York, because that's where you go if you're involved with stage theater. So he directs and produces sort of avant-garde black box kind of productions around the city. And then Ethan is our older son, who is in 5 days receiving a master's degree from NYU in film archives. So he'll be, if you know anybody who's got a film archive that needs an archivist, it combines great passions of his in terms of film history and criticism with archival work that he discovered along the way he really enjoys. So both of them live in Brooklyn. They're both in New York for the time being, at least. So that's a bit about us. I would say simply that I've always loved what I do. I've always loved being a parish priest. It's an extraordinary honor. It's a vocation that has its challenges, but extraordinary rewards. And at each stage along the way, in some very different sorts of communities, I've just loved being a pastor and preacher and administrative leader with some wonderful Christians in some wonderful places, serving Christ by the power of the Spirit. So that's been a great joy. And now, 8 months into this, it's a different role for me, and in some ways it's a little disorienting, because it turns out it's not the same. Being a bishop isn't just being a parish priest sort of writ large. I mean, there are many things that overlap, and then there are other things that are quite different. So I'm learning how that is, and grateful for the support of so many colleagues around the diocese and for the people of the diocese. So that's a word about me, and now I would just love to hear what you are wondering, other than what my favorite animal is. Do I want to change my answer? No, at this point I think you just got to go with it. Yes.
We have a mic, so if you have a question, if you could raise your hand and tell us your name.
Hi, I'm Judy. I was a Presbyterian and I was raised in Ohio, and I'd like to know, we're going back to Ohio in July. I hope you're not going on vacation. July 14th?
So are you asking if I'm going to be in Ohio on July 14th?
Yeah, because I'm going to.
Actually, I will be in Ohio at the end of that week doing a wedding, but not in Cleveland Heights, because of course one keeps one's distance for a while from one's former parish. But so maybe I'll wave to you on the I-80 or 90. Right?
I'm going to ask people also to stand when they ask the question too, so we can see them.
Great.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The right bishop here. I'm from Nigeria.
Yes.
So I would like to ask a question based on the doctrine across the country, in Africa and the Church of England, of the I'm talking about the Psalms, the chanted of the non-Dimitives and Magnificat and Tidium. So to compare between between the Anglican Episcopal Communion and England. That's what I would like to know. Your experience on this area.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So you're asking about my experience of the relationship between the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion?
Yes.
And the bit about the canticles?
Yeah, the canticles, non-Dimitives,
Right.
Magnificat, and Tidiums.
Okay, the Te Deum. Okay. Well, I'm not sure about the last part in terms of the connection, but so my experience with African churches most directly until now has been with churches in South Africa, which I recognize is a little bit different culturally and theologically than much of the rest of the continent. But my parish in Cleveland had a very close relationship with two congregations outside of Cape Town. In fact, the bishop of the Diocese of False Bay was at the consecration, if some of you were. So I think the doctrinal things that I heard you ask about, I mean, of course, we know that we have had rifts in the communion in the last 15 years or more around doctrinal things, although I would say honestly that the rifts have been more about culture and to a certain extent scriptural interpretation than they actually have been about theology or doctrine. I think that the rifts have often been a kind of manifestation of cultural distance or a shape of cultural relationship in the church that has mirrored the shape of the relationship, the sort of colonial shape of the relationship, so that I think that all these different things, sort of post-colonial, cultural rifts, frankly, and cultural legacies, together with some differences in sociological context, have gotten focused into us thinking that we're at risk of not being in relationship with our Anglican sisters and brothers. And fortunately, my sense is at least that pendulum is swinging back, that there's been a good bit of healing in the last some number of years, last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, so that we are coming to see what indeed the partnership that my church and the two in Africa, part of the reason that we initiated those partnerships was to assert that if we stay focused on the mission of the church and all that unites us, that we can not sweep under the rug the things that differentiate us, but that we can keep focused on ways in which we can move together and ways in which we are still related. And so my sense is that is broadly happening. In this diocese, we have quite a number of African congregations, as I'm sure you know. So we have Kenyans, especially up in Lynn. We have Nigerians and Ugandans, especially in Hyde Park and in Brockton. We have, of course, other non-African immigrant congregations, Haitians in a number of different places, and then, of course, Hispanic congregations. But my point is, the African congregations, it's often been a challenge for them within this diocese in particular, which, as you know, is quite progressive on the spectrum within the Episcopal Church. And so many of our African congregations have been susceptible to those who would suggest to their congregants that the U.S. Episcopal Church is not really Anglican, and that they should be headed to some other congregation that is more Anglican. But I'm grateful to say that my sense is that our African Episcopal churches are reasserting their identity as Anglicans who are now part of the U.S. Church. And I think it's a really good thing. Certainly, Sam.
Need to push out of your podium. I'd like to, one of the things we're talking a lot about here at Trinity is what it means to be a 21st century Episcopal church. With the shifts in the culture, the shifts in church attendance, the sense that sort of every part of our life needs to be re-examined. And you've now been in the diocese for 8 months, and you've been around seeing a lot going on. I'd love to get your sense of, are you seeing signs of a new church emerging, a sense that people are learning new things and trying new things and pointing in new directions? Because that's a lot of what our conversation has been. Thank you.
The answer is yes. And I would start out backing up a little bit, just to say something that I've said to the clergy a number of times, and want to say more broadly. I find this diocese to be, in many ways, far more energetic and collegially minded, and at some level sort of healthier overall than my experience when I served here in this diocese in the late 1980s. Now, at that time, of course, there were lots of issues flying around that were separating people, not the least the clergy of the diocese. And I would go to these clergy gatherings, and people would be yelling at each other. So we would have a gathering, and there would be a guest speaker, and the guest speaker would start to talk, and pretty soon someone would stand up and yell at that person for something that they perceived to be insensitive or somehow off the mark. And then somebody else would stand up and yell at that clergy person for having been inhospitable to the guest speaker, and off it went. One time the speaker was Rabbi Edwin Friedman. Do you know about him? He's written books on family systems and how churches tend to mirror systems and sort of dysfunctions of how systems get stuck until somebody can step in as the proverbial non-anxious presence and invite the system to a healthier place, focus on the strengths, and make it more healthy. So imagine Rabbi Friedman watching the Episcopal priests sort of go at each other. I actually heard that we were a case study in one of his subsequent books. But my point is to say that that's a generation ago. And we as a diocese are in a very different place now. And I think there are multiple reasons for that. And one of them is the spiritual groundedness and lengthy tenure of my predecessor, I think, who helped to lead the diocese into a much stronger and healthier place. But the other is, I think, Sam, to your point, that the church has been increasingly looking outward for the core of its identity and mission. And that's not at all to say that we're ignoring sort of who we are within the community. Elements of formation, pastoral care of one another, attention to the community. But those things, I think there's been a kind of a shift in the church to see that those things are all for the purpose of building up the body, which is then for the purpose of equipping us to be Christ in the world, to serve. And so that shift of focus, I think, has made us stronger and healthier, and though there are plenty of things that people don't agree about now, with the focus in a different place, the kind of energizing and spiritual core in a different place, we're now equipped to serve. And part of what that means is, I think, we're more equipped, though it's still a very great challenge, to figure out how the changing world around us is going to continue to call us to change. And it's commonplace and almost cliche at this point now to say, the church is going to have to change, it's a whole new era, we need to find new ways of doing church. The thing is, it turns out all of those things, cliche though they may be, are true. And I think the church in this diocese has been doing a really remarkable job of figuring out, in certain ways, how church might be done differently, but also how the traditional organs of the church, by which I mean mostly parishes, are not babies to be thrown out with the bathwater, if I can put it that way. I like to tell the story by analogy because it's, in my life, sort of illustrative of and very sort of formative for me. When Trish and I were at ADS, I'll try and tell the short version of the story. In the mid-1980s, the seminary had housing for students with families, sort of off to the east of campus over on Kirkland Street near Memorial Hall. And the seminary decided it would be better stewardship if the 6 or 8 faculty houses that were adjacent to the seminary, which are these great big old 3-story, 6-bedroom Victorians, if the faculty, most of whom were empty nesters, would be encouraged to go out on the market, get their own houses, and then remodel all of those houses into student apartments. It was a great plan. The problem was, they sold the Kirkland housing before they had remodeled any of the houses to move into. So if you happen to be, in the couple of classes that we were in with families, the new thing wasn't there yet before the old thing was gone. And so, the school said, well, we'll put you in Lawrence Hall, we'll give you 3 dorm rooms. Well, if you had kids, you didn't necessarily want to be using a bathroom down the hall and, whatever. So you get the point, I think, which is when we feel genuinely and legitimately called towards some kind of change of paradigm or vision or structure, I think we have to be sure that we're not moving to that, that has become developed and equipped before something else is undone. And so I think for most Christians, still, the parish remains the sort of frontline place where we experience community and an opportunity to worship and formation and strengthening. And I expect that, I've been a parish priest for 27 years. It's where my heart is. So what I think I'm trying to say to your question is, I think we have a twofold task simultaneously. And one is to be open to, really excited about new forms and shapes of the church. What might that look like? And there are some organizations, some ministries within this diocese. Life Together, I'm sure, is quite familiar to you. There's what I consider a quite exciting plan for the Church of St. Luke and St. Margaret in Alston to be experimenting with ways of being a somewhat non-traditional center for Christian ministry, often with young adults, though not exclusively, who can gather to be shaped and formed and serve their communities. So these things are going on around in the diocese. But simultaneously, we have to be also investing ourselves in being the most sort of vibrant and equipping and creative thinking, open to the spirit kind of parish leaders that we can be in our traditional parishes at the same time. So we see that happening. Yeah. Yes?
Hi, my name is Susan, and it was really good to see you last week at the Mothers March for Peace in Dorchester.
Thank you.
And to share communion with everybody there. Hi, Susan here. I've been helping out with the Oasis dinners out of Church on the Hill, Swedenborgian, and St. James for about 3 years, and I try to go weekly to help. And until about a year ago, they were held at the basement hall of the Episcopal Cathedral. And I guess y'all are doing renovations over there, so it hasn't been able to be there. But it helped 150 to 180 people a week. And I'm wondering when the hall is done, whether the dinner will, since it's been going for 35 years, will it be able to go back to the cathedral because it's such a large and good space?
Great. Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the work that you're doing. And so far as I know, all of the various programs and ministries that are sort of constellation of things that happen at and from St. Paul's are coming back to roost when the remodeling is done. I don't know about that specific one, and I'm happy to look into that, but so far as I know, it will be. The cathedral, as you well know, has a number of really strong ministries with the homeless population surrounding that neighborhood. So my assumption is yes. Sprout Hall, which is that Undercroft Hall, is part of the renovation. So you didn't ask, but people often do. What's the timetable? How's that going? If you've ever worked with renovation projects, you know about that. So it was originally scheduled to be done, I think, middle of the summer. And now the schedule is, so then most recently it was going to be done the end of August, and now I think we're into sort of mid-September. We're committed to holding the diocesan convention there early November. So that's a drop-dead date, as it were. But it should be ready before that. And the remodeling of Sproat Hall, maybe not quite as grand a scale as this spectacular undercroft remodeling, but the principles will be obviously accessibility, which Sproat Hall, I'm not sure it was at all, or if so, only with great difficulty. So it'll be easily accessible from the street level with an elevator, as well as improved facilities and a little bit more open. The nave, did anybody make it to the event? There was about, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago now, the Make Your Mark event where you were invited to take a Sharpie and draw on the floor? Yeah. So the floor is concrete, and so anybody wanting to was invited to come and write some kind of message there, or a prayer, or a sketch, whatever, and make your mark, over which then the tiles will be laid. So it will be, people were starting to look worried. No, so the tiles then will be laid over that. So it'll be there for eternity, or until, something happens before eternity. But not only to the author and God, which is kind of cool, I think.
We have a reception waiting for us. I don't want to chop you off any earlier.
5 more minutes? 2 or 3 more questions?
Yes, but let's keep it to two questions so we can get on with the next.
Great, a couple more questions. Yes?
My name is Ruth Davis, I'm a parishioner here, and I'm wondering, how do we transmit a Christian message to the younger generations of young adults who are in their 20s and 30s, for whom the church is irrelevant? And I'm sure you read the Pew report that just came out recently that says the nuns are one of the increasing segments of our population. And what are the cultural implications, looking down the line, of generations that do not have any kind of faith-based commitment, who find it irrelevant? And where does our message go to survive?
Yes. Huge question. Don't know if you could hear it. The question is how we transmit the faith, as it were, to the next generation, and particularly other questions couched in terms of young adults, the nuns, so-called. We're not talking about the sisters in Arlington and Duxbury, the NONES, those who would check nun in their religious survey box. The Pew research has shown us, is a significantly increasing sector, as is the spiritual but not religious sector. So, well, that's a huge question. I think one which, again, this diocese has an admirable, has devoted admirable energy and attention to, in terms of finding ways to engage young adults. What it turns out is that it's absolutely the fact that church and the sort of liturgical expressions of church are often no longer a presumed value for the next generation. So many of us grew up in a time when there simply was a presumed value to it. Our parents presumed it, their parents presumed it, and so you just came along, and the church itself didn't necessarily have to do a whole lot except be there to receive the people that came out of this presumed sense of value. And that's not true anymore. What is true, thanks be to God, is that many of these studies show that there is a presumed value among young adults, even those who might at least initially identify themselves as not religious. There is a presumed value on servanthood, on serving others, on reaching those who are in the margins. And that actually is remarkably strong in some of the surveys as a presumed value. So that goes back to my earlier comments about the church kind of re-understanding its core identity, not as much for what happens inside, though that's vital, but it's vital to equip us to the connections and the ways that we serve the world. That, after all, is the gospel mandate. And Jesus had very little to say to the disciples about how they oriented themselves sort of in the room, right? And had lots to say about what they needed to do when they went out into the world. That's the core. And so it turns out that in places where we as church are reflecting that understanding, the notion of presumed value ends up actually aligning with many of these young adults who are drawn into the community, perhaps not initially out of any historical family denominational loyalty or affection for the great hymns that we all loved singing this morning, or those things, but initially out of seeing the church doing work that they believe is important. And then, God willing, and by the grace of God, we begin to share the ways in which we find ourselves strengthened and nourished. So it's a huge question. I appreciate your asking, and it really underlies a lot of our thinking in congregations as well as in the diocese. And I know you had a big listening event, what, 2 weeks ago, 3? Which I presume that question was underlying a great deal of what you're doing, right at the heart. Yeah, so thank you for that, and I look forward to what I can hear from you. One 30-second question. My favorite animal is a bird. Yes?
Hi, quickly. My name's Adam Betzer. I'm the organ scholar here. And
Hi.
I was thrilled when you mentioned Messiaen because it's like, oh my goodness, someone else likes Messiaen. It's really very exciting. I think I speak for everyone in the choir, so when I say we appreciated your acknowledgement of the really hard work we do in the music ministry here. I think that with respect to these questions of tradition and forward thinking, music seems to be right at the center of it because a music program can please many people, but it can never please everyone. You can all agree on that. So I was wondering what your sort of philosophy about music is, choir participation, congregational participation, and maybe what your vision might be moving forward. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Adam. Yeah, Messiaen, so Carl Paukert, who was the organist choir master in my previous congregation, and who was Richard Webster's organ teacher 35 years ago at Northwestern. Carl played a lot of Messiaen. He was a real Messiaen scholar. And I can't say that I loved it when he first started playing it. Actually, no, it's very difficult. It's like certain types of art, of visual arts. It takes some work to be drawn into it, but it's rewarding, as with many sorts of art. So there's that. To your question, and Adam's presence and those of many other young adults in your choir and in your music program points to one of the things the church has been learning, which is that often, the assumptions of church, especially, 15 to 30 years ago, was that somehow traditional modes of expression of church music would not be considered relevant or nourishing to young adults. The song made some reference to how we did Siyahamba at the consecration, and then it said something about Kumbaya. We did not sing Kumbaya. We did not. We did sing Siyahamba, which is a wonderful South African. Anyway, my point is, so I think, first of all, I'm really grateful for places like Trinity and Emmanuel and many other places that recognize that actually relatively traditional church music is a point of entry for many young adults, even while we stretch a little bit. If you go to the Crossing, which is our emerging church gathering at the cathedral on Thursday late afternoon, they have a very different manifestation of music. But it's also not Michael, roll your boat ashore, you know. I mean, some of what we grew up with and loved when we were kids. It's not that either. It tends to be often Taizé style chants or sort of adapted, even adapted Gregorian things. So even in contexts that are, if you will, non-traditional liturgy, the depth, regardless of the genre, I think young adults, not unlike the rest of us, but maybe with a certain acumen these days, are looking for musical expressions in the church that really do have some depth to them, regardless of where they come from and how contemporary they are. So I'm really, thank you for being a place that supports a music program of the sort that this place is renowned for. Sam?
Time for a reception. Thank you, Alan Yates, for the